Greetings. Welcome to In Conversation with Trevor, brought to you by the Nyaradzo Group. I go beyond the headlines and beyond the sensational. Today, I'm in conversation with Dr. Fay Chung, politician and Zimbabwe's former education minister. Enjoy this informative conversation. Dr. Fay Chung, welcome to In Conversation with Trevor.
Thank you.
You know, I'm always look forward to talking to people of your generation because there's so much that you've given to this country, and there's so much for the younger generation to learn from you. So I don't take your coming here for granted. So thank you very much for that. And, you know, when I look at you, Fay, I am reminded of the promise that our education system had at independence and up to 1990. When I read your name all the time, I'm reminded of the great work that you put into what our education policy was, I think 1980 at independence up to maybe 1995 or so. Tell me, when you look at where our education is right now, the state of the schools, the teachers, the teacher training colleges, and indeed the product of that system, what goes through your mind?
I think the problem is we set up a system which was very suitable for the first 20 years of independence, but now it's lasted 40 years. So it became more and more unsuited to the changes which have taken place in Zimbabwe and which have taken place in the world. Because in 1980, we have to remember that a third of the African teachers in primary school only had grade 7, and a third only had Form 2, and a third were unqualified. And we had to form a primary school curriculum which suited their ability, although at the same time we had to upgrade them, which we did. I think for secondary, we were also constrained in that everybody, rich or poor, black or white, wanted Cambridge O levels. And we adjusted a whole lot of Cambridge, and Cambridge was very cooperative. But more or less, Cambridge was to prepare a third of the British students for university. And that's what we did. The O-levels, even with the many adjustments we made, still was preparation for university. And yet only 10% of our students go to university. So it means the education system became more and more unsuited to the majority of students.
So it was meant for 20 years. It went on for 40 years.
I think it was meant for 20 years.
Yeah. Why didn't we press the pause button and plan after the 20 years had elapsed? What do you think happened there?
I think the problem is within ZANU-PF, that in the liberation struggle and in the 1980s, in fact I would say until the executive presidency was formed, there was a strong intellectual baseline. But as we went forward, that baseline was weakened. I think in the 1990s, probably you remember, we removed all the top civil servants under the ESAP program. They were given golden handshakes, and they left happily because they got a lot of money. But the problem really was that our best bureaucrats left, and ZANU-PF was able to put in its favorites. Now, its favorites were younger, maybe 10 or 15 years younger than the ones who left. And also, they felt they owed their position to the politicians and that their job was to obey. So the bureaucracy changed, and it meant there was more obedience and less independent management.
So there wasn't the rigor, the analysis, the intellectual capacity to say, we created this thing to last 20 years. Let's revisit and see how we can build it for another 20, 40 years.
I think an education system needs renewal every 5 or 6 years, because so many things are changing. You know, for example, internet was not part of education in 1980, but now internet is essential. The way we teach today, even the way we hold meetings, is different from the way we did it in the 1980s, where we had face-to-face meetings, but now we really have to depend on Zoom. And then the jobs have changed. In the 1980s, anyone who had O-levels got a job. But now we have hundreds of thousands of young people with 5 O-levels who have had to go to neighboring countries and to UK to get jobs, where they are welcomed. But here in Zimbabwe, they have no jobs.
So we really ought to be focusing on how do we fine-tune the education policy to meet the needs of the new society, to meet the needs of the new workplace, but we haven't done that.
Absolutely essential. The attempts to renew education by Minister Dokora in 2016, in a way, failed because it made it more academic. Already the O-levels were too academic, training 10% of the students to do well. But now it's even more difficult because it's become more academic, because due to lack of funds and the way it was organized, teachers were not involved in the reform of the education system. So whilst you can say the university was very involved, it became more university orientated, when again 90% of students are not going to go to university.
Looking at the things that you did, I find myself asking the question, what was the philosophical underpinning of saying education for all? Of essentially remaking society using education, and the success that that eventually had around about 1990 thereabout. What was the philosophical underpinning to the whole policy?
Well, I've spent my whole life in education, from the time I was a student until now. I've worked in education. So I think I know a bit about education. I spent 5 years in the townships teaching secondary education. So I received a very important grounding in African education during those 5 years. Before independence, only 35% of children, of African children, went to primary school. And mostly the girls and women didn't go. And only 4% of those who completed grade 7 went to secondary. And only half of them were allowed to do O-levels. The others did something called F2, which was a low level of technical education, which was meant to be suited to Africans, so they would not compete with white technicians and artisans. So that's what we inherited. Now, we knew, those of us who were in education, that we had to have primary education for all. And we managed it in 1980s and 1990s. Everybody was in primary school. And now it's 96% in primary school of the age group, which is still quite good. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, the education system was suited to the 1980s particularly, and to some extent to the 1990s. So it's out of date.
Then you looking at some of the building blocks when you came in was teacher education using Zintech, which is a very quick way of ensuring that there was a high output of quality teachers. Talk to me about what inspired that and what challenges and successes you faced.
Zintech was very important because at independence, 30% of the primary teachers only had grade 7, 30% had Form 2, and 30% were unqualified. So it was very essential to upgrade our primary school teachers. And then we were going to move from 35% of children in primary to 100%, and we managed it. And that made Zintech essential. Zintech was very brief in a way because the initial course was like 20 weeks, and it was very long. The final training took 4 years. So the issue is, how do you train teachers for 20 weeks and what can they do in 20 weeks? And we ensured they had textbooks, they had teaching and learning materials, so they knew what to do in the classroom. But their training took 4 years. And during those 4 years, they were placed in schools in groups of 3. And we instituted training programs. Every 15 students had a district tutor who ran weekend courses and holiday courses for these trainees. And we trained all the heads. All the students were in groups of 3 in specific schools. We trained also all the education officers and all the provincial officers and all the heads. So the whole system was trained and the program was published. So every school had a copy. So a head was told to train his teachers. They're mainly his and very few hers. These heads had the training manuals in their schools, and they were able to institute 1.5 training for all the teachers. So all the teachers were upgraded in the 1980s and 1990s. So it meant we had a very good primary school system based on the 20 weeks training we did in Mozambique. So a teacher trained for 20 weeks can do basics if they have the textbooks and the teaching and learning materials, if they are supervised in the school, which they were by the head and deputy head. If the students were also evaluated, and we did that through the grade 7 exam, and through the 80s and 90s, we had 75% pass in 4 subjects.
Going back to the philosophical thinking, what the thinking was as you were building the curriculum, for instance, and training, was there an anticipation of what are these kids or children or students going to do when they come out? Was there a conversation with industry, or this was you with your experience and teaching together with the team in the ministry, your experience during the liberation struggle and bringing this in a vacuum without talking to industry, for instance? Was there that conversation?
There was an essential conversation. I had a white lady of Danish origin who was in charge of this conversation with industry. But you have to remember, in the 1980s, the industry was controlled by white industrialists. And this lady was very good. She went to so many industries and said, what is it you want from your primary and secondary school graduates? Now, You know, although European education was higher than African education, they cut off students at Form 3. Those whom they thought would not go to university were removed and given 1 to 2 years of technical training. So most of our industrialists from the old days only have Form 3. So when this researcher went to them and asked them, what do you want from education? They said unanimously, we want students whom we have employed as cleaners and who speak English, and we will train them ourselves. We don't need training. And that was a reflection of the industrial levels of the existing industries in the 1980s. Yeah.
As Nyaradzo, we strive to continuously bring convenience to our clients. Nyaradzo Group is proud to introduce Sawi, a new virtual chatbot assistant on WhatsApp. With Sawi, you are now able to interact with us from the comfort of your home and can be assisted anytime via WhatsApp. With life assurance products, diaspora products, applying and assessing your policy, payment platforms, claims information, and any other queries concerning payments, policy information, or products and services. Simply WhatsApp Sawi on +263 712 992892 or visit the link showing on the screen to register and start interacting and receiving notifications from Sawi on WhatsApp. Now, join in and experience a new level of convenience 24 hours a day with Sawi.
The other big picture thing is, at independence in 1980, only 5% of the black population in Zimbabwe had access to education, basic education. In 1993, this number was 95%. You've just mentioned the number of 96%. That's huge. But like you said, these are students that are taught the academic part, theoretical. And you have a situation where you have 95% of the people educated, but they are not able to create jobs. They don't have the skills to create jobs. They are unemployed. They speak good English, but they are unemployed. What's your sense of that?
I think you can see where we used to have 75% pass rates in 4 subjects. In 2020, we had 37% pass in 5 subjects. And they increased the syllabuses for primary from 4 to 12. But they did this without in-servicing the teachers. So teachers see the syllabuses, but they may not see how to implement it. Then the books, beautiful books were produced, but the copyright is in New York. Now you should wonder, why should the copyright for Zimbabwean textbooks be in New York? And they are expensive. It's $10.50 for a primary textbook and $14 for a secondary textbook, which means no parent and no student can afford these books. Whereas in the 1980s and 1990s, the primary textbooks were between 3 and 5 Zim dollars each. And the secondary textbooks were about 14 Zim dollars each. But we also provided 20 free textbooks for every subject to every school. So there's no such school at that time. There was no such school at that time with no textbooks. They either had the 20 or they could buy the 3 to 5. And in fact, parents could buy the $3 to $5 primary textbooks, and even the 14 Zim dollar textbooks, but now they can't. In addition, the ministry stopped giving administration grants which were used by the school to buy textbooks. Now schools don't get an administration grant. They also don't get a building grant. The building grant was intended to give the private schools, like district council schools and mission schools, a third of the cost of building a classroom. So let's say a classroom costs 10,000 Zim dollars in 1980s. Government was giving 3,500 in terms of doors, windows, roofing, cement was given to the schools. So the parents had to provide the builder and the labor and make the bricks. And so the schools that were built in the 1980s and 1990s was a joint effort by the community and the government. But then they stopped providing the building grant. Up till now, no building grant, no administration grant. So it means the school and the community have to build by themselves, which the richer communities manage to, but the poorer ones cannot.
We are not spending enough in education as we used to. But when we did, there was pushback from the World Bank and the IMF against the costs of education for all. Talk to me about that.
I think that was incorrect, and they've corrected themselves. In order to provide primary education from 35% to 100, and in fact it was 110% in the first years, we had to lower the cost of education. So luckily we understood educational financing, and we were able to lower the costs. Just to give an example, to educate a child in New York costs $500 US per child. To educate a European child in Rhodesia costs about $235 US per child. To educate an African child in Rhodesia costs like $25 US. These were the costs of education. Now, in order to provide education for all, we had to lower the costs to about $50 US per child. And we managed it. And that's how we could afford it. So it's not true that we spent too much on education. We had Chizero in terms of finance most of those years, and he always gave education 20% of the budget, which included primary, secondary, and tertiary. And I think that is the right amount for education. We never got more than 23% at the most.
Tell me, if you look at, if the sense is that our education system right now is broken, if you had an opportunity to fix it, what is it that you would do?
I don't think we can say it's broken. We could just say it's out of date. If it was good enough for 20 years, it was not good enough for 40 years. Yeah. I think it's essential now to reform primary education and return to 100% of children going to primary. So I think we have to remove the old-fashioned idea that the grade 7 exams must be marked by hand and go back to they are marked by computer. Secondly, the curriculum for primary. I think when we say we use educational financing to lower the costs of education to $50 US per child, it meant we said one teacher for 40 students. That was always the teacher-pupil ratio for Africans, but Europeans had as low as 1 to 9. So we raised the teacher-pupil ratio to 1 to 40 for everybody. But we allowed fees to be introduced. So now teachers are always complaining they are not getting the 500 US per month that teachers were paid before independence. Those were the white teachers. Now the number of students have increased from less than 1 million to about 6 million. And the number of teachers from less than 10,000 to 140,000. So we are paying our teachers through government, probably about an average of $250 US per teacher. But through the fees, they are paid more than $250 per teacher. So they are getting the 500 that they were getting, except at that time they got it straight from government. Now they are getting it through, half through government and half through the fees. So the fees are very high. Now, is it possible?
So we should go to education for all, being free education, primary and high school education. Is that what you're saying?
Well, you know, the Ministry of Education has been working on an amendment to the Education Act which says just that. But it doesn't take into account educational financing. What would you need to have teachers paid 100% by government, as the white teachers were paid before independence? You know, they were only a few thousand. Now when you have 140,000, you can't do it. So though in principle it is correct, in practice you have to look at pragmatic ways of enabling parents to provide education for their children. And we actually did it in the first 20 years. Primary education was, in principle, free. But the regulation was that parents could meet and they could decide ways to augment. Let's say they decided they wanted to build a library. They could say, we'll put in $10 each and build a library. Or if they say we need library books or we need workshops, they could do extras. And I think that is the way to do it, that government must provide the basics of primary and secondary education, but allow parents to improve. You know, like, why introduce hand-marked examinations when the computer can do quite a good job, really? And why do we need grade 7 exams? Just to look at the quality. You know, to say only 37% passed 5 subjects in 2020 is a disgrace. But
I found that, sort of my last question concerning education, that the fact that you knew that you'd be tested at grade 7 was an incentive to work very hard. The fact that you knew that you'd be tested at Form 2 was also an incentive to work hard. And you were tested at Form 4 and Form 6. That, for me, I don't know if I'm wrong, but it made us work very hard. We were focused, we were concentrated. Is that a correct way of looking at it?
I think generally students and teachers have been very dedicated and very concentrated, so you are correct. The issue is, why did we decide that computer marking is not as good as hand marking? Well, if you remember, teachers are paid for hand marking, so there's a lot of pressure from teachers to want to hand mark exams because they are underpaid, you know. So there's a lot of pressure from teachers to change the examination system.
Let's move now to you were part of the struggle to liberate this country from from secular domination, and you are a war veteran. There's a number of issues for me that either flow from the way the Liberation War was conducted, or issues which are outstanding and have not been resolved. One of the issues for me which flows from the liberation struggle is the violence. Our liberation struggle was violent, both on the part of ZIPRA, ZANLA, and the Rhodesian forces.
Yeah.
And my sense is we haven't spoken enough about the violence of the liberation struggle. We have not faced the truth of what happened. And my sense is that the ghosts of the liberation war, of our liberation struggle, continue to haunt us in the form of the kind of violent society, the violent disagreements that we have, the violent election campaigns that we have. Do you agree that that flows from the way the liberation struggle was conducted, and that we never faced the ghosts of that?
I agree. I think we need to look at how consensus is built. First of all, the political leaders. At independence, it was the Rhodesians and mainly ZANU-PF, ZAPU and ZANU. How do you build a consensus? And what was that consensus? Now, I think the consensus was very superficial. It said, whatever the whites had, we also want. Now, given that whites were 3.6 to 4% of the population, it was not possible that what all the whites had, everybody should have. But that was our demand, both as freedom fighters and as parties. For example, you see the students at the University of Rhodesia in Nyasaland, they were saying black teachers with the same qualifications should be paid the same as white teachers. You know, before independence we had 3 different salaries, four really, white men and white women, and black men and black women, four different salary scales. So even if you had the same qualification, you were paid a lot less. So the fight of the students was same pay for same qualification. But that in itself is ignoring the fact that whites were less than 4% of the population.
But I'm talking about the violence, the way the sense that the democratic culture of disagreeing over issues and not resolve our differences through violence, for me, is a problem that emanates from the fact that ZANLA, ZIPRA, the Rhodesian forces, there was lots of blood spilled to arrive at independence, and we've not been able to face that head on and resolve it.
I was getting to that point by saying we have to have a consensus on what policies we agree to.
Right.
Which we didn't from the beginning. We were still trying to say if whites had free health education, we would have free health education. If whites had free primary education, we would have free primary education. So I think ZANU, ZAPU, ANC, Muzirewa, all were wrong in saying some adjustment had to be made, that once we have 96 or 100% getting primary education, how would we deal with it? And we dealt with it pragmatically for 20 years. But we never changed the rules. So I think the rules of a society have to be adjusted to the reality. The use of violence was Rhodesian and ZIPRA and ZANLA all used violence. And I think we needed to look at why is violence needed. One could say, as government, you have the right to violence. That is, you have the police and the army and the CIO. But does ZANU-PF have the right to violence? I think this had to be tackled, and it was not tackled. It was like, if you support the Smith regime, anybody has the right to attack you, which I think is incorrect. I think we have to say nobody can attack you just for saying I support Smith or I support giving the land back to the whites. No. So the issue of violence, on the one hand, is the authority of government was undermined. And on the other hand, the use of violence by parties was condoned, mainly by ZANU-PF, but now even MDC is using violence. You know, that it should not be allowed.
And that's my point, that as a society, we've failed to face head-on the use of violence by anybody. The state is there, the government is there to maintain rule of law, constitutionalism, but we've carried on the habit of resolving our disagreements through violence, including the government is violence, ZANU-PF is violence, MDC is violence, we're all violence. Who is the adult in the house is my question.
See, where I disagree with you is to say it's a personal issue. I decide to be violent or not to be violent. I think this has to be a nationally agreed policy, which would be instituted into law. So it was totally incorrect to say the police could not intervene if MDC was attacked.
Okay.
That is wrong. The police job is to intervene whoever attacks. Yeah.
Talk to me now about one outstanding issue, the land issue.
Yes.
I see you wrote an article recently on that. What's the way forward as far as the land issue is concerned, or is where we are right now a finality? Although I get the sense that it leaves the door open for people to continue to want to take farms from whether you're black or white. The issue has not been resolved permanently. We've not drawn the line in the sand and say, this is it, let's move on. What's your sense?
I think since the fast track land resettlement program, we have created the system by which land is transferred just by grabbing. Yeah. And I think this is totally incorrect. I think we did the right thing in 1980s, where we used the 230 million that we got from the British government to buy land, and then the government introduced the system of land reform in the 1980s and 1990s, which was an excellent land reform system. So we have to go back to land and look at what has succeeded under offer letters and what has failed. And I think we have a lot of research to say that the small-scale industries, the small-scale farmers have succeeded. 400 studies have been done of small-scale resettlement under the fast track, and it seems they have succeeded. So I think the right thing is straightforward. We have to provide leasehold for those small-scale resettlement farmers who have succeeded. And I think if we do that, and they were able to get bank loans, and I think the bank loans have to be supported by government subsidies, it will enable the large and middle-scale farmers to also join in. So I think this will take us probably another 20 years, but it's an important issue. I think it's also important for government itself Not to say, oh, the British and the Americans should pay for land resettlement. Come to think of it, why should they? They've refused for 20 years. I think we have to say we as government have responsibility for land resettlement, and between 10 and 20% of government budget every year should be devoted to land resettlement and ensure that it's done properly. And this should be through the banks, not through ZANU-PF. Because as you know, when politicians give land, they give for political reasons. They don't give because you are a good farmer. They give because you support ZANU-PF. So the land reform should not be politicized.
Unfortunately, it is politicized.
It is politicized, which is a very serious mistake, because it enables ZANU-PF to ensure it is re-elected.
In 2008, you returned back. You came back into politics, and joined Simba Makoni.
That's right.
Talk to me about the thinking process of that, leaving ZANU-PF and joining Simba Makoni. What went through your mind?
Well, I've known Simba Makoni since 1980. And I know he's a very devoted nationalist. I know he's very intelligent and very technically and professionally first class. I knew at that time he was supported by Rex Nongo. And I knew at that time, 1980, that President Mugabe should retire. So I took the initiative and went to Simba saying, I'm joining you. He didn't invite me. I joined him.
Right.
And he was delighted. Yeah. But as you know, Rex deserted us quite early on. And I think Simba is a brilliant intellectual, but not a brilliant politician. And he couldn't play the political game. And ZANU-PF won. And
you, am I correct that you've been readmitted back to ZANU-PF?
Yes,
is that true?
I reapplied and I was readmitted this year.
Why did you? What has changed?
I think it seems to me that there are only two parties in Zimbabwe, MDC and ZANU-PF. MDC has split into two. ZANU-PF is still united. And I think what we talked about at the beginning, that it has no intellectual leadership now, that it needs the intellectual leadership to go forward. So people like me should come forward, who were in the origins of ZANU and who can provide some intellectual leadership. That's why I joined ZANU in 1973. I thought we from the university should be there in the liberation struggle, and we were. And I think if we were not there, we would not have had education and health and water supply in the first 20 years. I think that was the result of the intellectuals being there. And I think now ZANU-PF cannot go forward progressively without its intellectuals.
Have the things that made you leave ZANU-PF, have they changed to make you reconsider, or rather rejoin ZANU-PF, is my point?
I think the issue that we need intellectuals in a political party, whether it's MDC or ZANU-PF, remains extremely important. I think MDC had some intellectuals at the beginning, but they've also split and dropped off. And perhaps the two branches of ZANU-PF may or may not have intellectuals. And the same thing with ZANU-PF. It had strong intellectuals in the 1970s and 1980s, but they removed them.
You've written this book,
Yes.
which is a beautiful book. I recommend that the people that want to familiarize themselves with what took place during Chimurenga read it. In this book, you say, Fay, and I quote, one of the changes taking place in ZANU-PF was that it was rapidly transforming itself from a liberation movement into a business conglomerate. And you say that economic opportunities were available to those who identified with the ruling party and denied to those who opposed the ruling party. That is what obtains at the present moment, isn't it?
Yes, I think those who have money, whether white or black, they try to find a political ally because politics is closely linked to economics. So they will ally not with the losing party, but with whoever is winning. And this is true, that they will try and ally with the winning party politically.
But this is the party that you're joining. This party that right now corruption in ZANU-PF is very rampant. What impact?
I think the issue of corruption is there everywhere, and it is up to the party leadership to make strong policies to control it within its own party. What I mentioned earlier, that there should be a consensus as to what is allowed. For example, should ZANU-PF allow violence against its political enemies? We had a certain ZANU-PF leader saying they are going to be like the Taliban. But that should not be allowed. Yeah. So I think it is for the political party to take a clear stand, which so far it has not taken against violence or corruption. Are there elements within the party which would want to take this stand? Yes, I think ZANU from the beginning has been a conglomerate of everybody. Everybody who was against Smith would support the liberation movement, which means it included thieves and criminals, as well as the most idealistic people. They all joined, and they were all there in the liberation struggle.
And they're still there, younger and energetic.
Yeah, they're still there, because I remember how shocked I was. We was very short of food in Mozambique when some teachers, war veterans, stole all the sugar to brew beer. I was very shocked, but that's what they did, that they robbed the children of the sugar in order to brew beer. And it made me understand that not everybody who joins the struggle is a hero. Some of them joined because they were running away from the police in the Smith regime. Yeah, they had no opportunities, so they had become criminals. So they thought under ZANU there would be more opportunities.
You, like I said, you are a war veteran yourself. But the term war veteran has become so sullied, it's become so tainted because of what some people claiming to be war veterans have been doing over the years. What's your sense about how that ought to be corrected? The model of what a war veteran is, the model that we ought to celebrate, and for how long should we continue honoring the war veterans? What's your sense?
Well, I mentioned already that war vets included criminals and thieves and the best people in the world, people who were prepared to give up their lives, students who gave up going to university in order to go into the struggle and who were subsequently killed. So war veteran covers everybody who was in the struggle. Now, since independence, the number of war veterans has doubled. And that means the parties, both ZANU and ZAPU, were able to bring in people who probably were 1 year old at independence, who are now war veterans. Yeah.
But surely they are not war veterans.
They are not war veterans. If you were 1 year old in 1980, you could not be a war veteran. But then you have to remember that most war veterans now are about 60 years old. Yeah.
So genuine war veterans
are about 60.
So that's my point. Shouldn't people like you, genuine war veterans, guard jealously your reputation as war veterans? You know who was in the war, you know who participated in the war, and you should be saying, we will not be associating with those people because they are not war veterans. These people that were 1 year old when we became independent. Should that not be your mission as war veterans?
I don't think it should be a big mission, because the number of war veterans, say from Zanla, at independence we were 30,000. Yeah. How many have died since? Probably more than half. Yeah. So the number who are still alive would be around 15,000. And with ZIPRA, you know, they started to recruit just 2-3 years before independence, because they had the big blow up in the 1968s. So they are the ones who have more war vets who joined after 1980. So of course it's true, we could stick to the 50% or 40% who are still alive. And I think they have an important role to play. At the same time, I think both ZANU and old ZAPU are using the new guys to say they are war vets.
What's your view? Are they war vets?
No,
Is the
they are
person
not.
They're not.
They're not war vets. But I think now we need to say, what are the requirements to join a party, whether MDC or ZANU PF. So you don't have to say you have to be a war vet to join the party.
I would understand, Fay, and I think it's something that needs to be looked into, to say there are war veterans, for instance, from the war in the DRC. We might not agree with why that war was started, but there are some veterans that participated in that war, and some of them could have been born in 1980. So that's a different class of which war did you participate in. But I don't see that happening. Anyway, that's my senses to the war veterans issue, and that you, as genuine war veterans, should be guarding this thing jealously and make sure that nobody who was not a war veteran claims to be a war veteran. That's my sense.
I think my point is, I don't think it's the main issue.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think it's an issue, but it should not be the leading issue. I think the leading issue is, why should you join a party, either one or the other? And what are the common policies which all parties should adhere to? One is non-violence. The other one would be human rights. Now, as you know, the Lancaster House Agreement has about 10 human rights, and they're all about respecting white ownership of farms. It's about ownership. But let's say the right to work. It must be a human right.
Sure, sure.
Yeah. The right to food, the right to education, the right to health, the right to a shelter. I think we should go and look at the 1948 human rights and say our policies as parties must have these rights. And I think it has to be related to reality. Let's say the right to shelter, right? What are we saying? What is the right that me, let's say I'm in a family of 9, what shelter do I have a right to? Let's say I live in a city, what right have I got to a shelter? Let's say the right to food. Yeah.
So there's a basic human rights.
Basic human rights, yeah. And then I think in terms of the way I behave, let's say I'm a thief, right? Is there a way for the party to check whether I'm a thief or not a thief? Now, really strong parties, they check on you. But now we are told we have 5 million members whose names we don't even know. In fact, I think ANC has 1.3 million members, and their population is twice as big as Zimbabwe. And I think ANC has actually more members than ZANU-PF. So it means the 5 million members are people we don't know. So we need to say, well, those who are members will have to pay not nothing or $1 or what it is we
pay a subscription of some sort.
Yeah, and they have to have been members. Like say, Labour Party in Britain.
Yeah.
Or the Communist Party in China. You have to be a member for 5 years.
But that's a complete new way of looking at things and rebuilding the party.
It has to be built properly.
Absolutely, and hoping that rebuilding the party results in is a process of rebuilding society, isn't it? Because that's what we urgently require right now.
I think the parties are important. Yeah, it's doesn't help to say anybody who opens ZANU-PF email can join the party for nothing. No.
Fay, let's go to your upbringing is very interesting one. You were born into a Chinese family in Rhodesia. Talk to me about what it was like growing up as a Chinese in Rhodesia.
Well, my mother died when I was 3. So I ended up being brought up by nannies, which is why I have a working knowledge of Shona. At the same time, I had to spend a lot of time with my grandparents because my dad was very busy running his business. And I learned from my grandfather that he was always wanting a farm because he came from a peasant family in China. And he could never get a farm because he was Chinese. And he was always grumbling about it. He was saying, these whites are very greedy. They've got so much land and they won't even let us buy a farm. And since he was running his own business, he could afford to buy one, but he couldn't buy. Then I had an aunt who went to school when she was very young and spent about 4 years in grade 7 because there were no schools for Asians and coloreds to do secondary. And she was very frustrated, you know. I think if she'd been allowed, she would have gone to university and so on. She couldn't. So also, I've always been talking to people, and I had very good Shona. So I'd be speaking to my dad's workers. He had about 10 workers. And they would tell me what they thought, which was usually the same, land and education. Yeah, they would say, we are only being taught the Bible. We are not allowed to do grade 5 or grade 7. We are not allowed to go to secondary because they want us to be ignorant. And so we are ignorant. I've only got grade 5, and I wanted to go to secondary, and I cannot even send my sons to secondary because it's too expensive. And so I heard a lot from the workers.
And tell me, why did you decide to join the African Department of Education and not the European Department of Education? I'm very fascinated about that choice.
First of all, we were not allowed to be in the European education, although, of course, people like the Catholics or someone would make exceptions to the rule. Secondly, I was at the University of Rhodesia in Nyasaland in the 1960s, and it was a branch of London University. And our lecturers came straight from Oxford, the whole lot of them, 100% Oxford graduates with 1 or 2 Rhodesians. And they were very conscious about race. Their leader was Professor Ranger.
Oh, right.
Yes, he was there. He was one of the first lecturers there. And he wanted to...
Terence Ranger, Professor
yes,
Terence Ranger,
yes.
yeah.
And he was a very powerful person. Like, he wanted us to break all the racial systems in the university. For example, we were placed in all black hostels and all white. The girls, we had corridors which were only for blacks and for coloreds, and the whites had their own corridors because there was only one women's hostel. So there was an aim led by Ranger to break the color bar. For example, he persuaded us to join the drum majorettes, which was only whites. So some of us, blacks and coloreds and myself, we joined the drum majorettes, and we were drum majorettes in the all-white drum majorettes. And then they organized for us to go to whites-only hotels and restaurants. And we did. And we found if we were women only, they never beat us up. When they were men, they were badly beaten, and in fact Ranger was badly beaten and thrown into the Salisbury swimming pool and nearly drowned.
For crossing the color bar.
Yes, crossing the color bar. But for us women, we were free to go anyway. The whites never attacked us as women. But we became conscious of the racial issues. I remember we went to a film where they said, she can't go, she's not white. And all the students started to riot, the white students, saying, she has to enter. So I said, no, I'm going home, I don't need to go to this film. And I left. But it was interesting that all the whites demonstrated for me.
To go in.
Yeah, and this was true in the student elections. They would always be coming and say, why don't you stand? You know, I didn't like standing for politics, so I would say no.
What did that rejection do to you, Fay? I mean, what did that do to you?
Well, I didn't feel it was important for me to be in the students' union. So when white students came and said, you stand and we'll vote for you, I would say no. Because at that time I was not particularly conscious politically. But obviously at that time Africans would have been like 20%, so they couldn't get in.
Oh, wow.
Through elections, unless the whites voted for you. And they would only vote for Africans who were very friendly with them. Yeah, those Africans who were critical of the Rhodesian system, they couldn't get elected.
There's one thing that you did, Fay, which I must ask you. You are perhaps one of those few people that asked that resigned from being Minister of Education.
Yes.
And you asked to be transferred somewhere else. Talk to me, how was that conversation with Robert Mugabe? Why did you do it?
Well, I must say the main reason was our success in education. So
You were happy you had done it.
not only that, but I was being offered jobs by UN agencies. I remember with UNICEF, they asked their UNICEF officers, and they have about 100 officers worldwide, who is the best minister? And they said, Fay.
Mm-hmm.
So then I started getting offers to become head of education in UNICEF or director of education in UNESCO. And by that time I was about 50 years old. And of course I read everything, and I know once you're 55, that's the end, you don't get into UN. And I thought, I'd like to be head of education in UNICEF.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to do it now when I'm 50.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, the chance disappears. So I told the UNICEF director, I accept,
Uh-huh.
but I'll delay it by 18 months. And he accepted. Then I told President Mugabe I'm resigning.
Mm-hmm.
And I think President Mugabe personalized everything. If you resigned, it was like you were against him.
Mm.
Yeah.
So you said you're resigning, and he took offense?
He took it personally.
He took
yeah,
personally?
Because I had criticized him for what happened to Nyagumbo and Mutumbuka. And the system under ZANU-PF at that time was, you can go to him and criticize and say, that's a big mistake. And he'd say, why? I said, look at Nyagumbo. He's taken 13 cars, but he hasn't got a car. He gave them to his followers. Now you are giving him a public trial where every unemployed Zimbabwean can attend. And they jeered at him, and he couldn't take it. Same thing with Mutumbuka. He didn't have 13 cars. He bought one car and he sold it. And I think it's Prime Minister Thatcher said, you sacked your best minister because he bought and sold a car. Are you sure that was the right thing? And I also said to him, I think it's wrong.
And so Mugabe didn't like that
He didn't like
criticism.
that.
Did you make that criticism on a one-on-one?
On one-to-one, yeah.
He didn't like that. What was his response to you?
He didn't respond, but he didn't say anything. I criticized both the handling of Nyagumbo and Mutumbuka. But it was only 6 months later that I resigned. So it was like I'd taken sides with Mutumbuka and
Wow.
Nyagumbo against him. Yeah.
And he didn't like that.
He didn't like that, yeah.
But still he agreed to give you the Ministry of Employment Creation and Cooperatives?
That was before. Anyway, one of the reasons I also felt was I was wasting my time. They didn't believe, I think Mugabe, Chidzero, Didymus, all didn't believe in employment creation. And I kept saying, this is your biggest challenge. This is what we have to do. And we had so many meetings with Mugabe, with Chidzero, nothing.
Why do you think they didn't believe in employment creation?
I think they thought that would be done by industry which was controlled by whites. Now, to believe that the whites were going to create a few million jobs is delusion, you know. Those whites, first of all, they only had Form 3. Secondly, they were interested in their own companies, rightly so. And they were trying to keep out any Africans who were coming to compete with them. They would report Africans who competed with them for corruption. And the government would go arresting and taking their money and saying, you are corrupt. And after a 2-year investigation, they say it was incorrect. But meanwhile, your opportunity to compete with the white company had gone, you know. So I didn't believe a white control agricultural and industrial system would create millions of jobs. And I believed we had to do it through government intervention. But then that was the time of ISAP, which said that government should weaken itself by sacking all the top leaders in the civil service and by not taking any part in employment creation or in any companies.
Fay, do you have any regrets at all about your involvement with the stuff that you did as a cabinet minister, Minister of Education, or looking at where the country is right now? Do you look at stuff and say, I regret that we as a party did that, or I as an individual did that? Do you have any regrets at all?
I don't regret.
Okay.
I feel I knew ZANU before independence. I knew we had criminals and thieves. I knew there was competition and rivalry within ZANU to do better. So I could see the positive sides of it. And I think there are still negative and positive sides to ZANU.
Even up to today. Fay, it's been amazing talking to you, going back in time and you know, going through the important role that you played in building the foundation of our education system. So allow me, Fay, to thank you so much for creating the time out of your busy schedule to join us. Thank you so much. And allow me to turn on to our viewers who are in Zimbabwe, in Africa, and all over the continent to thank you for watching In Conversation with Trevor, which is a weekly show. We are out every Monday on YouTube at 7 a.m. Central African Time. To ensure that you don't miss out on any of these quality conversations, press on this button and you get a subscription and a notification every time we have one of these quality conversations. We've gone a step further and created a podcast. So if you scroll down below this video, you'll find the link. Click for your listening pleasure. Until next time, cheers to you all.